a significant piece of legislation? Nobody knows. And the president is going to sit back to a certain degree and say, well, I'm going to watch and see what you can actually produce among yourselves. One reality in the Senate is, yes, there is a smaller Senate Democratic minority, but they still have the 60-vote rule. They watch Republicans use it relentlessly against them when they were in the majority. And the remaining Senate Democrats are almost to a person inalterably opposed to the dominant themes of the Republican agenda. Nearly all, not all, but nearly all the Democrats that would have in certain instances been willing to vote with Republicans, well, guess what? They got defeated on Tuesday. So Republicans are going to have to find almost all their votes themselves, and the president's going to wait and see if they can do that.
They can, even if Mitch votes 53 votes, right, it's not enough. He can't pass it, and that's part of. And what Boehner can pass out of his house with a larger Tea Party caucus. Is that going to be acceptable even to the 53?
Exactly.
Right. I think that's a key question. Are we going to see the Ted Cruz Senate, or are we going to see the Mitch McConnell Senate? Even prior to these elections, we saw Ted Cruz from the Senate meeting with House Tea Party leaders to rally their support for things like the government shutdown or repealing Obamacare. Now we've got a new incoming House caucus that will have some members who are even more conservative, more likely to line up behind a Ted Cruz faction of the party than those outgoing. So as Major said, first we'll have to see those tensions settled. I also think that a key test will be, what does the president do on immigration? How does he flex his muscle and use his executive authority there? Mitch McConnell has already warned that an executive order on immigration would be like waving a red flag in front of a bull. So we know that President Obama will do something. He's been saying so for months. He's promised to do it by the end of the year. The question is, what will he do? Will he expand to lower the deportations, or to give more rights to more categories of those who've come here illegally, as he has done for the so-called Dreamers? And how will the Republicans react?
And during this lame duck Congress, he's also going to ask for money for Ebola, money for ISIS. How is that lame duck Congress likely to react with immigration included in that mix?
Well, the timing of immigration will be crucial. Now, remember, it's a Congress, so Democrats in the Senate still control the Senate schedule, and the House has to deal with at least one item on the president's agenda. We've got to keep the government open. You have to pass a continuing resolution. Within that, the president has asked for $6.2 billion for Ebola funding, all emergency, meaning it doesn't count against the deficit. Republicans are taking that in, so or Democrats, it's a big number, but everyone is sort of aware that Ebola, not only here in terms of preparedness, but in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, the United States must step up and be the world leader to try to stop and contain the virus there. And the president has also thrown another thing into the mix, which Republicans have long asked for, but weren't expecting in a lame duck context: rewriting the authorization for the use of military force in Syria and Iraq, no longer relying on the 2001 post 9/11 authorization to use military force, but draw it in a way that is more relevant to the campaign in Iraq and Syria. And there are Republicans who want to afford the president the opportunity to introduce U.S. ground troops. Whether or not the president's going to want that to be laid out specifically in that piece of legislation, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we will probably see the budget taken care of. There are tax extenders that need to be taken care of. Those things are pretty likely to happen in the lame duck. We'll probably see Harry Reid push forward with some nominations to try to get the 200 or so people who've been in limbo moved into their positions.
How likely is he to get any of those approved during the lame duck?
I think he'll get some of them approved. Like as Major pointed out, the Democratic majority comes back, and they have a new rule in the Senate in which they can do it with a majority vote. And so he can go ahead and do it. I'm not sure it's going to be the Attorney General that would be pushed through a lame duck, because frankly, it's not much of a benefit to the person who becomes the next Attorney General to have been brought in such a way.
Right.
Better to have buy-in from the new Congress. But there are over 200 people who are in limbo, and nominees who are in limbo, and many of those are not necessarily terribly controversial. But in terms of the dynamics in Congress, I just want to add there's one other element here, And that's, what do the Democrats do? Nancy Pelosi has dragged John Boehner over the line every time he's had to pass a continuing resolution and to prevent a government shutdown. What is she going to do? Might she not bring her people to the table? We know through reporting she was furious that her members were attacked on the campaign trail for casting votes that bailed out John Boehner because he could not get his caucus to go along. And at the time, the threat was never again. Let's see if she delivers. Again, look in the Senate at Reid. How angry might Reid be after 6 years of Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz and Rand Paul using every piece of power that they had to block legislation that Harry Reid wanted to pass? Are they suddenly going to be cooperative? I kind of doubt it.
Well, another key thing, we've talked about the fissures within the Republican Party, but let's think about the Democrats too. Harry Reid was the boogeyman of this election, along with President Obama, and his staff has made no secret of their own disenchantment with the president. Democrats, many of them feel that this president created the demise of the Democratic Party in the South. We saw Kay Hagan lose her seat in North Carolina, Mary Landrieu's on the way out, Michelle Nunn, who seemed to have a decent shot in Georgia, at least maybe to get into a runoff, lost by a whopping 8 percentage points. So Democrats are now looking around the South and thinking, oh my goodness, we have to rebuild. And why do we have to rebuild? The governor of Arkansas said the other day, why? It's Barack Obama. So there are fissures within the Democratic Party too. And I think it will be interesting to see going forward how Senator Reid, new Minority Leader Reid, relates to President Obama and Nancy Pelosi as well.
But thanks to the Republicans, those fissures exist outside of Washington. Those fissures aren't really here. The Republicans took out the last white male Democrat in the South.
John
there
Barrow.
are none left. John Barrow in Georgia.
In the House, in the deep South.
In the House.
And Mary Landrieu is soon to probably be defeated in a runoff.
So those fissures won't play out inside of Congress.
Let's talk for a moment about gas prices, which seem to be in free fall. What's happening, Major?
Well, lower demand and more production. That's kind of classic economics. I remember it from basic economics in college. I probably remember a little else from basic economics in college, but I do remember that. And one thing the president said on Wednesday at the press conference is, look, the energy situation in this country is better and improving. And he answered that in the context of a question I posed to him about Republicans pushing the Keystone XL pipeline. He said, look, yeah, that's one of the things I've got to process at the state. But look, in the grand scheme of things, our natural gas production, our oil domestic production, then we turn into gasoline at the pumps, is the envy of the world. And whatever you think about Keystone, I think it's a really teeny part of the whole debate. So I'm dismissing it right out of the box.
Isn't there a downside to these falling gas prices? Couldn't the oil and fracking industry in this country be affected, Cheryl?
Well, they're saying that these falling gas prices could be the end of the fracking boom in this country. And one reason that we're seeing, as Major said, it's simple supply and demand, right? So we have increased production, we have falling prices. I do think, as Major said, the falling prices may deprive the Republicans of an argument that they would otherwise have used to try to get this Keystone pipeline built. And that's high on their agenda.
And just one other aspect of this, if the president were here or his economic team were here, they would say, we could not have asked or imagined 12 months ago to have a better overall macroeconomic atmosphere for this midterm election than we had. It didn't help them. And it didn't help. And there was a great sense of frustration within the White House that they were reliving part of the saga of Bill Clinton's presidency in 1994, where the country had, in many ways, climbed out of the recession of 1991 and 92, but the country didn't perceive it. There was a huge backlash. Republicans took control, and Clinton and his economic advisors then, and many of the president's economic advisors look around themselves now and say, wow, we are in really better shape than people perceived, but perception is everything, not actual data sometimes.
Major Garrett, CBS News, and you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. The monthly job numbers came out today. We dropped a bit of a percentage point to 5.8%. unemployment, which certainly looks like good news, but the overall number, just 212,000 new jobs created as opposed to 250, 275. What do they tell us?
Well, what they tell us is that we are on track. It's a steady, modest recovery. It's not robust by any stretch, but we have had consistent job growth for months now. The unemployment rate lowest in 5 years. People who are counted as, the broader unemployed, those who are in part-time jobs, wish they could be in full-time jobs, that fell too. It's still a little over 11%, so it's not a great number, but it went down. That number has been rather stubborn throughout this recovery. And so, for once, the recovery seems to be now starting to tick away at those people as well as the broader population.
But wage stagnation is really the issue.
Yes. So hourly wages have been stubbornly stuck at about average of $24.50 an hour. I'd also note that while unemployment is going down, really it's not being experienced evenly by the population. So teenage unemployment remains at almost 19%. Black unemployment remains at almost 11%. Hispanic at nearly 7%. So as always, certain segments of the population aren't experiencing
and
this trend.
Here you've got companies, corporations still holding on to their money and not raising wages. What does the White House have to do with that?
Very, very little. I mean, there's nothing a president can really do other than to jawbone publicly. Now, there is one thing that is on the table. It was raised at the press conference, and Republicans and the president both identified it. There is about, estimates run up as high as $2 trillion of offshore money that major American corporations have that they will not repatriate from profits overseas because the corporate tax rate here is, in their judgment, too high. The president has said, I'm open to lowering the corporate tax rate. Republicans certainly want to do that. That's not a surprise. Can you create a mechanism by which both sides can do that? Will Republicans give any ground on individual rates, which the president would like? Probably not. So the president's only remaining compromise offer is, all right, that money comes back in. The Treasury gets some of it. Let's dedicate it to infrastructure projects that are more to my liking than yours. We'll get some of yours, but we want more of mine. Ports, bridges, roads, and things like that. That is a possible area of not insignificant compromise. There are a lot of details yet to be worked out, but it's one of the ways to address, if not wages, but getting offshored money back into the American economy and back into the American Treasury, because it's doing only marginal good, if any, where it is currently.
So that's possible.
Yeah. Well, the thing, one of the things that is around that compromise that is really important are the advocacy groups behind it. And that's the U.S. Chamber and the AFL-CIO. Because the argument for it is one about jobs, in addition to bringing some of that money back into the U.S. And so the U.S. Chamber wants the bridges built. AFL-CIO wants the workers to get those jobs. That's a pretty powerful lobbying. And the U.S. Chamber just spent a whole lot of money to put those people in power.
Jean Cummings, she is Deputy Managing Editor of Bloomberg Politics. Short break and right back. your calls, questions, comments, and remember, you can join us and watch a video stream of the program at drshow.org. Let's go first to Fort Worth, Texas. Hi, Mark, you're on the air.
Good morning, Diane. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I'm going to lump a lot of details as fast as I can. I've been hearing that people scratching their heads why the Republicans won as much as the House, yet the ballot initiatives about minimum wage were passed, which on the surface appears to contradict what the voters really wanted. What the voters really wanted was something to counteract one number, which is 28 hours. Employers have to pay ACA insurance over 28 hours, which means that all part-time workers basically get capped at 28 hours. Well, with 7.25 national minimum wage, it's very difficult to live on that. So they did two things. They voted in people who felt that they could get that particular part of the ACA raised to a more realistic number to be able to work. If that didn't work, they increased their minimum wage. This was all spurred upon by in December, when the Republicans were able to knock a lot of the long-term unemployment insurance down and get rid of those benefits, which threw a ton of people back into the job market, which is why we've seen the job increases that we've seen, but they're not making enough money, and now they're finding out why.
All right, and let's hear a response, Cheryl.
So I would say that I would be surprised if most voters are Machiavellian enough to think that, okay, if I vote to increase the minimum wage, I'm doing so because of this provision in the ACA. But I do think the caller has an important point, and that is that provision that redefines the work week to 30 hours is a matter of some contention. And Republican leaders have already said this will be among their priorities, is changing that 30-hour-a-week provision to 40 hours. And there is some Democratic support for it, although, as Major mentioned earlier about energy, some of the Democratic lawmakers who supported changing that, like Mary Landrieu, may no longer be in Congress. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see that as an item where maybe they can get some cooperation from Democrats.
All right, to Richard in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Hi there.
Hi. I'm wondering, having grown up in Chicago and watched Mayor Daley dictate to anybody that was a politician there, I see the same sort of thing with Barack Obama in that he deals in Chicago politics. And I don't know if he recognizes that Tuesday he lost. Not only did they take over the Senate, there are more Republicans in state houses now than there's ever been before. So he needs to understand that he can't dictate to everyone as he would like to, my way or the highway, and find a way to do what he wanted all the Republicans to do, which is to reach across the aisle to find a way to make compromise if he's going to have any kind of possibility of getting anything done over the next 2 years.
Jane.
Well, the caller makes a good point. The president was somewhat dismissive in that when he said only a third of the electorate came out, and essentially I was elected by 2/3. And so my mandate's bigger than your mandate. I was really, he did take a really tough and sort of in your face stand, and the caller is right to sense that. And as to the Republicans' takeover of state houses, I mean, where Republicans can draw their own lines, they win. And they can draw their own lines in the U.S. House, and they can draw their own lines, their own district lines in state houses because they had won the legislatures in the 00 election, or the 10 election, which is when redistricting occurs. And so that was a good triumph for them now, because it's going to be even harder for Democrats to fight their way back. And I think Republicans are going to be in charge of state houses for a long time, because they are probably going to hold those seats in the next round of redistricting in 2020.
One thing the president is going to have to consider, and it's the inevitable consideration of every president in the last 7 to 8 years. What's the legacy? How do you define it? How do you define it on your terms? And there is a developing historical argument that looks at the first 2 years of the Obama presidency is very productive, intensely oriented along the lines the president campaigned for, and the large majorities he brought to the House and Senate replicated in legislative language, and in significant ways changed the way the country dealt with a big recession, dealt with its banking regulation and healthcare, huge issues. Then there was this sort of 4-year interregnum of very difficult negotiations with Congress where you essentially achieved things in the negative. You didn't close the government down and you didn't default, and you changed the tax code in the middle. What is the bookend? What do you do with these last 2 years when you are the president, but the opposition party controls both ends of Congress? Do you define it in terms that protect, defend, and assert the legacy you created in those first 2 years? Or do you reshape at least part of how you define your presidency and its net accomplishments by taking some Republican ideas, sanding them down a little bit to your satisfaction, and calling it a deal?
And history has shown, Diane, that parties, when one party controls Congress and the other party controls the presidency after a midterm election like this, there can be some cooperation. Less so in the last 2 years of a presidency, especially on the domestic policy front, because let's face it, President Obama is a lame duck president right now. But past presidents like Ronald Reagan have been able to carve out foreign policy achievements. He was able to carve out some nuclear arms treaties with Democrats after the midterm elections in which they took control. In 1994, of course, this was just 2 years into Clinton's presidency, he was able to work with Republicans, Newt Gingrich, to balance the budget and to achieve welfare reform, of course, at the end of his
presidency. Unhappiness of Democrats.
That's right. And of course, we saw what happened at the end of the Clinton presidency after the 98 midterms, where he wound up getting impeached. Some talk of that with President Obama. I don't think so. But
there's a very big difference, though. There's a very, very big difference from the Reagan years and the Clinton years. And that is the nature of the Republicans in Congress today. They came to Washington not to pass things, but to get rid of things. And that was not at all the attitude of Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich wanted a legislative record of his own. He wanted to make change. And of course, Reagan was dealing with Democrats, and they, do want the government to function and are willing to pass legislation. So I think one of the hardest things that Obama will face, and as will Boehner and McConnell, is what we have already discussed, and that's managing the internal conflict within their own caucus.
Okay,
right, but they want to win in 2016.
I want to talk about here, the money spent in this election on both sides, Major.
Well, tremendous amounts. I don't know what the final reckoning is, but
It's around $3.7 billion.
almost $4 billion. Okay. And you had a lot of outside spending. The Democratic outside super PACs played very prominently. It didn't work. I would say what we're beginning to see in the last two elections, lots of big money spent on both sides, and the fundamentals still apply. What's the message environment? What is your ground game? What is your candidate recruitment? And how much are you sticking to your political knitting in between elections? And Republicans make, I think, a mildly credible case that 18 months ago, they began the hard work, having been defeated and demoralized in the 2012 election, of recruiting, building a message, and building a ground game that was able to achieve the goals it set for himself 18 months ago.
With
That's how you win elections.
Of money.
With lots of money, sure. But it wasn't as if Democrats were around the country without any money.
Exactly.
They had plenty on their side.
Some of the goals already stated by Republicans to diminish the size of government, get rid of the Department of Education, get rid of the EPA, get rid of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. How likely are those things to happen in the next 2 years, Cheryl?
Can you say veto? I don't think.
Zero.
I mean, it's not going to happen. I mean, President Obama said at his press conference, I think, or his aides have said he's going to veto things. If they try to do that, we'll see the veto pen.
All right.
And one thing about that, Diane, in 2016, for Senate Republicans will be up for re-election. Many in states President Obama won once or if not twice. The map does not favor Republicans in the way it did this midterm election. Some of those Republicans are going to look for compromises, and they're not going to go back to Pennsylvania or other places. And you know what? I just voted to get rid of the Department of Education.
Let's go to Louisville, Kentucky. Hi, Christian. You're on the air.
Hi, Diane. Great show as always.
Thanks.
I've got a question here. When I listen to two sets of neighbors, one set are African Americans who, by and large, did not participate in the midterms because they felt the president was being highly disrespected, and his record is outstanding. And I consider him to be the Jackie Robinson of politics. You know, he has to play an amazing game just to get grudging respect. And I want to know if you felt that this was sort of a Ty Cobb versus Jackie Robinson kind of news cycle where, you know, President Obama's not given much credit for having unemployment, you know, more than having the deficit, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Cheryl.
Well, I'm interested in his use of the Jackie Robinson analogy and in thinking just about kind of the racial polarization of the electorate. If you look at who turned out in this election, 75% of those who turned out were white, only 25% minorities. The traditional Democratic constituency of minorities, young unmarried women, and young people really did not turn out and participate in this election. 13% were young people. That's down from, I think, 19% in 2012. The gender, 51% were female, down from 53% in 2012. If Democrats had any chance of doing well in this election at all, it was to turn out those voters. And those voters traditionally drop off in midterm elections and may have felt demoralized and stayed home. Republicans, party dominated by white men, turned out in greater numbers, and that's what we're seeing.
Well, it is true that you know, much of the Obama coalition didn't show up, but they did in Colorado, and they did in North Carolina, and they did in some of the targeted states. The African-American community in Georgia showed up. The whites just didn't vote for her, and it's just that simple. She got like 23% of the white vote. I think credit also has to go to the Republican Party. As Major said, they started almost 2 years ago, recognizing what are the lessons learned here and trying to apply and some changes. And one of them was they did work up a ground game that I think did have an effect. I don't think it's as good as a Democratic ground game. It'll get better, but they were out there in North Carolina and they were out there in other states. And I do think it made a difference when we're talking about 2 points in a race.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. And clearly, as you all know, the NPR family lost one of its favorite people this week. Tom Magliozzi, a co-host with his brother Ray of Car Talk, which has been on the air for 35 years, started in Boston as a local show, expanded all over the country. People loved hearing the laughter. What are your recollections, Cheryl?
Well, you know, this show was a show that was ostensibly about cars, but really it was about life, and it was about the love of these two brothers. And as you mentioned, just the laughter. I was such a fan of that show. I started my career as a young reporter in Providence, Rhode Island, so not far from our fair city of Cambridge, where the brothers came from. And then I moved to Los Angeles to work for the LA Times, and I would listen to Car Talk faithfully because it reminded me of home. And I was so saddened to see the loss of Tom Magliozzi.
You couldn't have written better comedy for them than they produced organically, naturally, and repetitively. And they engaged their audience in a way that I've never really seen two brothers or any kind of radio host. Engaging with an audience on radio is a difficult thing. I don't need to tell you that, Diane. And they did it with such ease and such joy, and it came across. I know nothing about Cambridge. I grew up in San Diego. I worked in Amarillo, Houston, Las Vegas, and D.C. I don't know anything about that geographic part of the country, really. But I know those guys, and I love them, and I will confess, a tear came to my eye when I got the news, because I missed the show already, and I will miss him.
Well, what struck me when they suspended the show, and undoubtedly because of Tom's health, was you suddenly got a sense of really how long they had sustained this program and how popular it was for decades. And they were doing one of the replays, and a woman in some small town in the South had gotten herself a Porsche, and she got it in part. She was a doctor, female doctor, and she was trying to break into the male doctor world.
So she bought a Porsche.
So she got herself this really cool car as an icebreaker, because the guys would talk about her car. She called them up and she said, I don't know anything about my car except it's a cool car. Can you give me one or two facts that I could have for a cocktail party where I could throw them out? Well, they started thinking it through and trying to come up with something, and they, they weren't really getting there. And I thought, my God, why don't they just like Google it? And then it hit me. There was no Google. This show was so old, it predated the internet. That's how long those guys were around.
But you can still hear it on replays.
Yes, and tomorrow at 10 o'clock on this station and on stations across the country, there will be a remembrance, and Ray will talk about his brother. There'll be excerpts of past shows. Doug Berman said, and he was the producer of the program, they were completely themselves in an uninhibited way, and rather than being a disaster, they became completely comfortable doing that. They created this unique hour where people were entirely themselves, just normal, regular people. So we say farewell to Tom Magliozzi, who died of complications of Alzheimer's disease. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for having
me. Thank you, Diane.
Thanks for listening all. I'm Diane Rehm.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture, Susan Casey, Rebecca Kaufman, Lisa Danielle Knight, Allison Brody, and Alexander